O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the storm.
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are discussing the American Revolution. The American Revolution, which many people know about, was from 1775. Would you say?
That was when Lexington and Concord happened. So
the war began then. The events that led up to it were before then, but then it ended in 1783 officially with the Treaty of Paris.
Yep.
The Revolutionary War. So we're going on the heels of our Great Awakening podcast. This was just after the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening began in the late 1730s, I think.
Yep.
And then basically sort of ended in the late 1760s, or right up until the 1770s. The death of George Whitefield was in 1770. And the Methodist movement was still very big in England at that point. So I guess in Western history, the reason we're going next to the American Revolution is this is the biggest event in Western, quote unquote, European history after the Great Awakening. Would you say?
I'm trying to think about that. I mean, it depends. As Americans, for sure. But yeah, no, there were a lot of other wars. I mean, even before this was the 7 Years' War, which was considered a world war, and obviously it influenced the American Revolution. But looking at it from our perspective, yes, this is a very big event.
Well, from the world's perspective, isn't the American Revolution? It's unique among revolutions and among wars. Pretty much there were only a few wars or revolutions like this, right?
And I would say one of the big things from the world's perspective is the founding of a republic,
right?
And then how is that going to go going forward? And then also as everybody else is trying to still colonize the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, and now you have a nation among them, is definitely changed things.
Would you say that it is that the United States was the first republic since the Roman Republic, at least in the West, or the first big one? The
first big one. There were definitely like small city states. I think Florence had one.
I think actually Geneva was part of the republic.
But there were smaller examples of that kind of scattered throughout, but definitely on the biggest scale since the Romans.
Yeah. And also, the American Revolution, in spite of what many historians and historical, experts, so-called, might say in our country or in the West, the American Revolution was hugely influenced by Christianity. And we can see that from its influence, from its the after effects of the Great Awakening on the American Revolution. So to recap the Great Awakening, that ended up with thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people, making professions of faith, largely through the preaching of George Whitefield in the colonies from the 1740s up until 1760s at least. So you have a massive amount of the population that's being saved.
Yeah.
At that point.
And I think we mentioned it before, but they estimate that 3/4 of the American population would have seen George Whitefield.
Right. Even if they weren't saved, they had at least seen him and heard him. So hearing such a person has, since it was such a large portion of the population, it has a huge impact on their views of leadership, of the impact of the spoken word and of the gospel and of religion in general. So you have that, the Great Awakening, people getting saved. If you were in your 20s, or around there, during the beginning of the Great Awakening in the colonies, by the point of the beginning of the American Revolution in the 1770s, you were then in your 50s. So you were a middle-aged man, if you were a man, I guess. And if you're a woman, you're obviously middle-aged. But so the leaders of the revolution were youths when the Great Awakening began. So that actually, what that tells us is that a lot of their ideas were brought from the events of the Great Awakening. A lot of their, they were developing their worldview at that time, and part of their worldview was that the preaching of the gospel is powerful and it changes lives, and that Christianity is, if not God's religion, it is a huge religion that has good effects. And we can see this in the case of Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
Because Benjamin Franklin, who was obviously a huge player in the Revolution, he was a personal friend of George Whitefield, who was the most influential preacher in the colonies during the Great Awakening. And he actually supported George Whitefield with his own money, and also by printing George Whitefield's sermons.
Yeah.
So although Benjamin Franklin was never converted, he was still influenced by.
And I would also say you get several of the leaders, like Benjamin Franklin, who would classify themselves as a deist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still, well, it's not Christian. It's more sympathetic towards Christian ideals and still looking at them with God, like still seeing how God has impacted the world.
All right, and also promoting at least outwardly good, mostly benevolent behavior, because Benjamin Franklin was huge on actually. Okay, well, unfortunately, he was pretty hypocritical.
Yeah.
But he actually wrote out like rules of life, and he tried to discipline himself to be.
Now George Washington, he was big on just moral living.
Right, George Washington was he was very moral, and he was we'll get into him later on what our thoughts are on him. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on him, Casey, but we'll find out.
Yeah, we will
as we go. But so Great Awakening happened. People are saved. And by the point of the revolution, this is something I want to emphasize in this episode, is that one of the key players in the American Revolution were the pastors of churches. Because the revolution was not just political, it was obviously hugely political. It was very religious. They most of the revolutionary supporters grounded their justification for revolting against the British government on biblical grounds, on spiritual principles, that they had a God-given right to stand up for the abuses that they considered the British Crown was inflicting on them. And one of the huge as we're going to see, one of the huge influences that motivated people to support and to join in the war effort were the pastors and the preachers who actually preached that they need to defend their country, they need to stand up to the British. So now let's go into what led up to the revolution. So the situation with the colonies, they had been away from, they're an ocean away. They had been founded a century and a half earlier, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are different times, but basically, yeah.
Basically, so for about 150 years, by the 1760s, they have been, living over there in the New World.
Yeah. And so also you're having more and more people that are born in America.
Right.
That, like, they're not just from Britain and think, yes, I'm British. They're more like, right. I was raised here. I've never been to Britain.
Right. Casey, what was the political situation in the colonies in the 1750s or 1760s,
yeah,
before the revolution?
So kind of like you said, they've been there for a while, and for quite some time, Britain had been pretty hands off with the colonies. Just be like, yeah, they pretty much run themselves. You keep shipping us goods, we're happy enough. Then came the French and Indian War, as Americans call it. I think it's called the 7 Years' War for Europeans, which was a huge war. Britain ended up defeating France, basically. I think there were other players in it.
And it wasn't in the 7 Years' War. I'm sorry. Yeah, the 7 Years' War wasn't just fought in North America.
Oh, no. It was all over.
Yeah.
But so the thing with that, though, is it was fought in North America somewhat. Right. There were battles there, and... sorry, excuse me. And afterwards, Britain wins, and they're looking at, I think it was 122... sorry.
You're okay. Maybe you should drink some more.
Yeah, well, they're looking at 122 million pounds of debt.
Wow. Which
is just staggering when you think that this is in the 1700s. And so, they look over at the colonies and like, well, we just fought and, protected them from the French and the Indians. They should pay some. Mm-hmm. And so then you start, well, first of all, you get the Proclamation of 1763. Sorry.
You want something else to drink?
No, you got it.
All right.
I'll take a drink of water.
The Proclamation of 1763. If I'm... let me guess.
Okay.
I'm testing my memory here. Did that bar people from settle? All the people in the frontier had to move away from the frontier. Was that?
Yeah,
that
basically they drew a line, like kind of where the Appalachian Mountains are. Said you can't cross that, which didn't settle well because they all wanted to cross that, and there were already people over there, and there was nothing they really could do to stop it. The reason they did that was because of they didn't want to incur further friction with the Indians. They were actually more concerned about the Indians than Americans were.
Yeah.
So you have that, and people weren't very happy about that. And then they start introducing some taxes. You have the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, and basically, and some of these are not, like you look at them and they're not very big taxes.
I forgot what the Townshend Acts are. Can you briefly explain those?
The Townshend Acts were just basically, I'm trying to remember, it was basically taxes on certain goods. I think it was like paint,
okay.
Some types of food. It was
that, various little
yeah, just taxes on certain things.
Probably named after a member of Parliament.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the Tea Act, which led to the
Boston Tea
Party. But then in retaliation for the Tea Act came the intolerable acts, which those were ones which are more like turned a lot of people against them, because it blocked the Boston Harbor. It basically made it so the king appoints who the governors are instead of the people voting for the governors. It made it so it gave Canada more rights and basically made Catholicism like open to like coming in. And there was there was a justice aspect of it where if the king wanted to try somebody, he could move them to what court he wanted to. So he could bring them over to England.
Right. And
they're like, well, there goes a jury of your peers.
Yep.
And then there was about quartering soldiers, which basically said that you have to house them. And so these ones were right before the revolution. All the colonists were very unhappy about that. Excuse me.
Yeah, no problem. So, yeah. I remember that, especially Boston is the biggest harbor, at least in the northern area of the colonies, and so they're very unhappy because I remember the unrest began in Boston. So you have shortly after the Tea Act. After the Stamp Act, you have a Stamp Act Congress. Actually, here's a date in history. October 6th, I think. October 8th of 1770, whenever the Stamp Act was.
That was in the 1760s. 1765 was the Stamp Act.
1765, yeah. And October 8th, I think, of that year, or 7th, they had a Stamp Act Congress where they met together to discuss. Some of the delegates of the colonies met together to discuss what they were going to do about the Stamp Act. the Stamp Act. Yeah, Stamp Act.
Yeah.
So after all these acts are passed, what do the colonists do?
Well, so remember too, there's 13 different colonies, and so that's that's a problem coming into it because each of them are in different circumstances.
Right.
And so you have Massachusetts, which was very much ready to revolt.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you get the Sons of Liberty with like Samuel Adams,
Right.
and they're all like just agitating.
Yeah.
And like boycotting, and though they did get the colonies to agree, all of them, to go on a boycott. So you have this general thing where the colonies are working more and more towards trying to do their own goods. Like trying to not need stuff from Britain as much.
Yeah.
But the Massachusetts guys were very worried that these other colonies wouldn't be on board. But as you go forward as you go through these different things that the British were doing, it's kind of funny how like each of them hits different colonies in different ways, but all negatively. So all the colonies are like, all right, I can be on board with that. And when I say all, there were a lot of loyalists still.
Yeah.
It wasn't like everybody in the Americas was pro-revolution, but there were enough there was a majority enough to get them to get on board with this.
Right. And speaking of loyalists, from what I heard, the statistic is about a third.
Yeah, I think I've heard that before.
About a third of the population of the colonies were still loyal to the British government, to the crown, to the king.
Yeah, and then you have the whole. So as the British bring in soldiers, it's weird to think about how the American army.
And why did they bring in soldiers?
Part of that was. Well,
it's because of the unrest, right?
Partially the unrest. They did bring in soldiers, like, well, there were during the French and Indian War, obviously, right. But then also they wanted to be more involved after that. They're like, all right, we need to. So they did have like soldiers around in general,
right?
And the Americans are like, you never had soldiers here before. You just won the war, defeated the threat, and now there's soldiers here. Like, are they for us? And so the Americans weren't big on that, obviously. But so the Americans, and even before this, how they worked with the militias was kind of interesting, where it's more just like everybody needs to know how to fight, like to shoot a gun, and when we call you, you're supposed to come.
Right.
And so if you think about it, this heightens the tensions when the soldiers are there, because you have this just not exactly, by definition, it's not a standing army, but a readily available fighting force.
Right.
That if you're not happy with the soldiers, be like, we'll just call the militias, which is what happens at Lexington and Concord.
Right.
Is it begins to be a little bit of an arms race as far as who's in control of the weapons caches, and the British are like marching out to these different places. What was that?
Boston. Well,
all over.
Yeah. So what? Let's go to that event. What triggered? So leading up to Lexington and Concord, what triggered that conflict?
Yeah,
that fight.
So
it had something to do. It had something to do with the ammunition that the colonists were. Now, so we had. They're already revolting. They're boycotting British goods.
Yeah.
They have actually the Boston Tea Party was a huge part in instigating the British, because we have is these colonists going to, I don't know how many boats, but however many boats they went to, they dumped like how much tea did they dump overboard? Thousands of pounds
a ridiculous
of
amount.
tea. So they're destroying British
goods.
Which
if I may say on that too,
yep.
Not just the Tea Party, the British at first when they're making these laws did not understand American sentiment. Actually, you could argue they didn't understand it right through the war.
Right.
They were at first, when the Americans were like, "Oh, like the Stamp Act, we're gonna boycott it. How could you do this to us?" The British were surprised.
Yeah.
They were like, "What? Whoa! Like, how did that happen? What? I don't understand." And then that's how it started. The British were really caught off guard. Mm-hmm. And then then they kind of like, "Well, we're not gonna back down." But actually, the Tea Act had not that much to do with the colonists. It had more to do with the East India Trade Company, which was doing terribly. And so it's kind of like a bailout.
Okay.
And it was basically like, we'll give you a monopoly of the American colonies, and that'll give you a place to sell your tea. And actually, it'll make tea cheaper for the Americans. And it did, but the Americans were like, you can't just manipulate us that way. Like, at this point, they're already, like, boiling in a rage. So they're like, you don't just get to, do a runaround on us like that. And so they get there, and the T's sitting in the harbor, and that ramped up until the Bostonians threw a bunch of it in. Anyway, back to Lexington and Concord. Yeah, basically they're seeing that tensions are rising, and the British, I think it was Concord, where there was a bunch of ammunition and weapons stored.
So and that was a little ways outside of Boston.
Yeah, and the British are like, we need to, and they had already seized a couple of places like that where like we don't want the Americans to be able to get these weapons. All these weapons, and the Americans are seeing this happening. They're like, "All right, is this war?" And so they call out the militias, and basically the British are able to. I think at Lexington, the Americans line up, and the British shoot. We don't know who shot first, but the shot heard around the world.
What people think is that, from the historical accounts, firsthand accounts of the first shot.
Yeah.
Most of them say it sounded like a pistol, and none of the Americans would have had a pistol.
Yeah.
So they think it was a British pistol that went off. At first, they weren't going to fight; they were just confronting them. And now the American. Now here's a lesser known fact about those militiamen, or the Minutemen, or militiamen, whatever you want to call them. They were actually led by a pastor.
Huh.
Yeah, he mobilized them, and he called them out to. What they were going to do they were prepared to fight, but they were actually not intending to fight. They were simply going to go out there to say, "You British need to go away," basically.
Yeah.
And obviously that didn't happen because the shot went out, and the British took it as mistook it as starting a fight. And then the British fired a volley into the Americans, and you have several of them dead and wounded. Some of whom were the members of the pastor's congregation.
Yeah.
Sadly, so they left, and then the British continue on their way to Concord, and you can pick up.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is a good picture of how the war went. When they meet in the field, the British fire their volley, the Americans scatter, the British are like, yep, we took care of that. And then as they go down the path, they just keep getting picked off.
Well, that was after they were coming back. So they got the ammunition from Concord, the British. Then as they were going from Concord back to Boston, that's when the Americans... So more and more of the militiamen from surrounding communities had heard about it. And were going towards the British. So as the British were traveling, they were hiding behind the trees and the bushes and just picking them off. And so you have probably dozens of British soldiers being killed.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, like I said, a good picture of the war where it's just because you go through the battles in the war and it's just Pyrrhic victory after Pyrrhic victory for the British, where they win strategically the battle, but they look at the numbers after and they're like, how do we lose that many men? This is way harder than it should be, because based on how everything went, like, we did it by the book.
Yeah.
And so the same thing there. And then after that, this really sparks the Continental Congress to decide, what are we doing? Like, we're in open conflict at this point.
How did the Continental Congress start? When did that start?
It started... So this was a second... So... This Lexington and Concord happened in between the first and second Continental Congress.
Oh, okay.
The first one met, and basically, I think they sent a letter to the king, and basically airing some of their grievances and saying what they wanted to do, and they weren't really sure.
Yeah.
After this, though, they were like, "Oh, like, we're in open conflict now. Are we going for independence? Do we want to reconcile?" And it really forced their hand, and that was when they drew up to get the Continental Army and put George Washington in charge.
Mm-hmm. That was 1775. So you have Lexington and Concord, then the Second Continental Congress. So they appoint George Washington as the best qualified to lead their army. So now that it's open war.
Yeah.
This is the beginning.
Yeah, and this is so by 1776. George Washington is going out and there's an army and they start drafting up the Declaration of Independence. And they're in open revolt at this point.
Right. So in the situation in Boston, you have the British troops. They are besieged by the Americans who are around them.
Around the city, yeah.
Right, and eventually they're driven out.
Yep.
I forgot when Washington's army actually gets there, but eventually it's after. I think the British leave because they're being besieged. Then the Americans take over the strategic position outside of Boston, where Bunker Hill is. Although there was another hill called
Breed's Hill is where actually the fighting happened.
Breed's Hill. Then you have the British go back to that area and assault them, and they're driven out. The Americans are driven out, and they lose.
Again, another Pyrrhic victory.
Well, yeah.
Well, no,
right.
I mean,
you mean at great cost, because many of the British were killed.
Yeah. So when I say a Pyrrhic victory, that's actually named after a Grecian general who went to Italy to fight the Romans and fought 3 battles, won all 3, but then had to leave because he had no men left. Because
they had plenty of men left. The British.
They did, but it still became a term for, winning the battle
at great cost.
At great cost to where it's almost not worth it.
Right. And on the Battle of Bunker Hill, a note here, a 71-year-old pastor named Benjamin Pomeroy, he fought at Bunker Hill, and after the battle, he became a chaplain in the Continental Army. So you have the British victory at Bunker Hill. I forgot the date of Bunker Hill, but then you have the Declaration of Independence, which is drafted, published, stating that we are independent states, and we're just going to conduct ourselves as a separate nation.
Yeah.
It didn't actually declare war. I don't know what actually declared war on the British.
Yeah,
I'm guessing it was just
I think that was mostly assumed that they were in revolt by declaring themselves free.
Yeah, and so these are the battles of Lexington and Concord, and then Bunker Hill. Those are the 2 main big events that sparked. Now you have the colonies they're together. They're conducting the war effort together. You have a continental army from all the colonies that that is under the leadership of George Washington. They're being trained, and then close to that event was actually before that, I think, Fort Ticonderoga.
So Fort Ticonderoga was big in that. So you get Ethan Allen, and he actually meets Benedict Arnold going there.
He's a general, Ethan Allen, right? Or a colonel?
I forget what his actual rank was.
Some leader.
And they get to Ticonderoga, which is hardly manned.
On the Hudson River,
yeah.
Which is a huge fort on the Hudson River.
But it's hardly manned to the point where they show up around it, and the British guy in charge is like, yep, we're not going to fight. You can have it, because they didn't expect him to just show up out of the wilderness, because that's what that was, basically.
Right.
And the big part about this is they had a lot of guns there. They had a lot of, artillery guns.
Oh, that's right. That's where the Americans got the guns
for Boston
to bring back to Boston to besiege the British.
Which was quite a trip.
Right.
They're like, how are we going to get these guns? And they literally had to drag them from the Hudson River to Boston.
Right. And Henry Knox was.
Yes, he was.
He was the leader of the artillery.
Yes, he was.
He helped them. Which was, it's kind of humorous and. Kind of like stereotypical in my mind of an artillery officer. He was actually a fat man. But anyway, I go ahead.
No, there you go.
Oh, so that was before. I'm sorry. That
was before
we mixed up. That was before the Battle of Bunker Hill, obviously. But that was big. It was a big event.
That was why the British left Boston.
Right.
Is because when the Americans show up with artillery on the hills, suddenly this got harder.
Right.
And they go down to New York City, which is basically defensible to the point of invincible.
Yeah. And shortly after this, you have Benedict Arnold surrender the fort to the British?
No. That's
right?
way later.
Oh, it's way later.
Yeah,
okay.
a lot of things happened first.
Okay. You need to refresh my
right.
American Revolution history.
So I
Next
guess
major event after.
So at this point, George Washington has an army in the field, and he
small army.
Yeah, small
several
army.
thousands.
Well, that was actually pretty big for the numbers they were all dealing with.
But compared to European armies,
yeah, no,
and also the armies we think about today.
Every conflict that they're going to fight is going to be very small, compared to what you want to think in your mind. Right. I think American casualties for the entire war was like 5,000.
Yeah.
And 7,000 is a big army for what they're fighting with. A lot of times it's like 1,000 or 2,000.
Right.
But yeah, these are small numbers really. But George Washington is facing off against General Howe, is in control of the British forces, and basically Washington just keeps getting beat at every turn. Washington is one of
where did he get beat? Long Island is one place. Right?
Basically all around New York City.
Yeah.
That he's kind of dodging in and out there.
The British now have control of Boston.
No, they left Boston. They pretty much just left it.
Oh, okay.
I mean, so it's.
So they gained it to just leave it to the Americans.
Yeah, pretty much. Once all the soldiers left, and then it was just up there by itself, and they went down to New York City.
Now they focused on New York City.
Yeah, and so in the British. So if you think about the objectives of the war, the British, they have to destroy the army in the field, because when I say destroy, it doesn't mean kill.
That's what they think.
Well, but it makes sense though, in that the revolt isn't done if there's still a rebel army out there, and so we need to make that army go away, whether it be through surrender or just somehow. And so really the American objective is don't get destroyed. And Washington comes very close to doing that several times, but like I said, his tactical abilities are questionable, but he is a tactical genius at escaping.
Right.
And so he constantly is in like bad situations and somehow manages to get his people out of there.
Right.
And so they stay in the field, and that leads to Trenton, which basically by the
what
end,
year?
1776.
1776.
Yep.
Okay.
So by the end of this year,
I'm thinking of something else.
It's very demoralizing for the Americans. Basically, our army just keeps getting beat. We're just narrowly evading disaster.
In the New York area.
Yeah, which is really where most of the fighting was at this point.
Right.
And also, when they would conscript people, or when people would sign up, they'd sign up for only like a few months at a time.
Yeah. And
so you have this pressure where everybody's able to go home on January 1st. And so Washington's
of 1777.
And so Washington's like, we need to do something to make it so that not everybody goes home. And so that's when, the day after Christmas, he crosses the Delaware River and takes Trenton.
The early morning hours, right?
Yeah, which actually
I thought it was on Christmas Day. Oh, that's right. It was because the way they used it was because it was a Hessian force. In Trenton. Germans. They were celebrating. Yeah, Germans. They were celebrating Christmas, so they're going to be drunk. They were going to have a hangovers.
That's a misconception, actually.
Oh yeah.
They had gotten word that George Washington was planning an attack, and so they were actually not drunk.
Interesting.
But so here a little bit on this attack.
At least they were asleep. A lot of them.
Well, I'll get to that.
Because they didn't. Okay, go ahead.
So George Washington. So this is where his tactical ability really falls short. You see this even in his great victory at Trenton, where he sends like a quarter of his men across the river to the north side to swing around. He sends a quarter of his men to the south side to swing around, and he gives them several hours, and then he crosses the river with the main force, and then immediately divides it into two. And so he's divided this into four sections, and they still have.
Why would he divide it into two when there's only one place to go?
Well, he wanted to attack from four sides at once.
Oh, okay.
But they're several miles away from this place.
Gotcha.
At night, in a storm, and so a
winter storm.
Yeah.
Snowstorm.
And so miraculously, two of these four groups attack at a similar time, and are able to take it. And days later, it took them a couple days to find the other groups. And it's just and all of his points were so. When he would draw up a battle plan, it was just so concise, but would divide his army into so many different pieces and require so many exact things to happen at the perfect timing, which was really not your best way of planning at the time, especially with no communication. But so as Washington is going to Trenton, he meets a small group of 50 men of militia that had just raided Trenton. And he was like, oh no, like they've alerted him. But actually, as I said, the Hessians had heard that there was going to be an attack. And so this raid, they thought was the attack. Because they're like, yeah, surely on like Christmas night and it's bad weather, that's all they'll do. And so then after that, they kind of like relaxed, and a lot of them went to sleep, and they thought the raid was over. And then the actual attack happened, and he took it, which was big for American morale, basically to say like, hey, look, we won a battle because we've never done that before.
Right. Okay.
So then going forward, We'll go to my buddy Benedict Arnold. I shouldn't call him my buddy. My buddy before he turned into a traitor.
All right, let's take a short break.
Okay.
Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. So we're picking up from the American victory of the Battle of Trenton, which I just unfortunately realized wasn't as glorious as I thought it was. But we're going back to...
There's a really good painting of him crossing the Delaware,
I know. Though. But anyway, we're going back to Benedict Arnold, who helped take over Fort Ticonderoga. We're at the beginning of 1777.
Yeah, well, we're going to backtrack a little bit.
Okay.
And so, actually, at first, Benedict Arnold was a part of an attack on Canada.
Yeah.
And basically, Canada was just a little outpost at this time. And they got up there and they attacked, and it didn't work. It was way up in the wilderness. But Benedict Arnold and a lot of the men are still up there. And one of the British plans in 1776 was to have, I forget who the general was at this time, come down from the St. Lawrence and then get down to the Hudson.
I think it was Burgoyne, right?
No, that's the year before. This guy gets replaced with Burgoyne.
Gage, then.
Okay. And come down the Hudson and basically just squash the American forces.
Yeah.
And there's one of the only sea battles, if you call it a sea, on Lake Champlain. Mm-hmm. Basically, they have to cross Lake Champlain, so the British start building boats. And the American forces are not a large group, and I think it was Horatio Gates maybe, or maybe he came in later, that was with the Americans that was actually in charge, and Benedict Arnold was like second in charge. And Benedict Arnold's like, I can build a fleet. And so he has Benedict Arnold build some boats too, which are inferior to what the British do. But basically on this battle, I forget where it was called, Benedict Arnold leads them and holds up the British enough that by the time they get down to... They didn't even make it to Fort Ticonderoga. It's winter. They're done for the year. And the British rulers, like the king and the parliament, was like, you didn't even make it down there for like the year? We were counting on that. That's where Burgoyne comes in. And he's like, I've got this plan where we all do like a pincer thing on New York. Take New York, which is the center of it. Divide New England from the southern colonies. I'll come down the Hudson River that way. And I'll send a force to the west, and they'll come over and attack, and General Howe will come up from the south. And so he starts coming down, Burgoyne does, and they called him Gentleman Johnny. He brought a lot of luxuries and stuff. He just kind of thought they were going to waltz right into it. This was going to be his glorious victory. So here's where Benedict Arnold really almost like wins the war for the Americans. So the group he sent out west goes with a lot of Indians, and they have to take this fort, which they do, but it's more bloody than they thought it was going to be.
Who takes the fort again?
The British do.
Okay.
And so they're starting to come Benedict Arnold takes a small group west to try to like gather militia and fight this group, and nobody wants to join at this point after the battle that they just had for this fort. Everyone's like, that was way more than we thought it would be.
Yeah.
And Benedict Arnold has a captured loyalist and releases him with faulty information on purpose. And he goes back and tells them like, oh, this group of this many is coming, and basically the Indians hear this and they're like, all right, we're out, like we're done, and they leave, and the whole western coming across the west just falls apart because of that. And so then Benedict Arnold rushes back towards the east, towards the Hudson River, and as Burgoyne comes down, then there's 2 battles at Saratoga. In the first one day, basically, Benedict Arnold is commanding, and I think it was one of those where the British technically won the field, but they lost a lot of guys. Yeah. And it set them up where Burgoyne then hunkers down in a stronghold. And after this first battle, Horatio Gates wrote to the Congress and basically said how he did so great in the battle. And Benedict Arnold wasn't mentioned, and Benedict Arnold was really unhappy about this. And so they kind of had some words about it, and Horatio Gates, I think he transferred him. Somehow he relieved Benedict Arnold of duty. Yeah. Said, you're not supposed to fight. You're done. And so then the next day, when it's this Battle of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold is off at like the local tavern, and he hears all the guns and the artillery, and after a while he can't take it. So he gets up and he goes to the battle, and the Americans are not doing so well. But he shows up and he rallies them to himself, and there's like a strategic defensive front that they couldn't break through. Right. And he like literally leads it as the first man, and he gets shot through the leg, and they managed to take it. And then after that, Benedict Arnold gets court-martialed. Wow. And so you can see why he's a little bitter. I mean, apparently it wasn't easy to get along with, but the defeat at Saratoga, where Gentleman Johnny had to surrender, so all his men are gone, the whole army. Was just
sorry. What was the Gentleman Johnny's last name again?
Burgoyne.
Burgoyne. Okay.
And so this sends shockwaves through Europe. Yeah. The British are like, what? Like, and our army was just defeated in the field. Like, we just lost an entire army. And the French are like, we've been watching this. You know, like, if we think you can win, like, we'll help you because that'll help us.
In the meantime, up to this point, the Americans were trying to get the French to.
Yeah, they've been trying with the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, you know, anybody that will. And the French obviously hate the English. And so they're like, well, we're not going to get involved if it's just going to be a quick revolt thing. Yeah. But like, this is like, you just defeated like their biggest plan and an army, like the whole army surrendered to you guys. So this played a critical role in the French joining them. And so then the British at this point aren't done yet. They get more men, but the French joining really makes it more complicated for the British, because then they're worried that the French will attack them, like in Britain. So they have to keep a lot of their forces actually in Britain, and a lot of their navy over there to protect them. And it also opens up down in the Caribbean. There's a whole theater of war. So it takes a lot of pressure off of the Americas just by the French saying they're in. So that was the big thing of 1777, except for then going into the winter was Valley Forge, where basically the Americans under George Washington, they winter, and it's very... They have...
Valley Forge, not too far out of Philadelphia, right?
Yeah, and they have like no supplies whatsoever.
Right.
And
before we go to
go ahead.
Valley Forge, something I did not bring up that I should have, because I could have saved until the end, but when I was saying that preachers were very influential in the beginning of our discussion, a lot of these men, fighting men in the American forces, were pushed and persuaded by their pastors to join the war effort. They're one of the hugest enemies of the British in the American Revolution were the pastors and the preachers. The British called them the Black Robed Regiment in the beginning of the war. So I was going to say this, but I forgot about it. So after you have all the fighting start in Boston, the Boston area. You have many of the pastors who see that the British are oppressing them, who are fighting against them. They have already up to this point been saying that the British are tyrants, especially the British king, and so in most of the big congregations in the colonies, the pastors are preaching revolution, are preaching we must stand up against the oppressors. We must resist tyranny. In fact, one of the biggest slogans in the revolution was resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. So it's a just war theory, that we are fighting a just war. And so I just wanted to note that most of these soldiers, if not the majority, if not a huge majority, the majority of them were at least partially motivated by religious convictions, that they were fighting a just war. They were fighting against a tyrant who was oppressing them and declining them of their rights. You need to do something about that, Casey. Anyway, so I just wanted to note that at this point, with these soldiers suffering, so they have no food in Valley Forge. It's bitter cold. Their clothing is worn out. They're eating their shoes for food.
Yeah, so they literally had at the beginning some flour and water. Mm-hmm. That's what they would mix together and eat, and then they ran out of flour.
And they weren't even getting paid. They were promised pay, and their pay was late. They weren't getting paid. And what did they use their pay for? To send it back to their families, and their wives and their children.
Their pay, which is printed money by the Continental Congress, which basically equals nothing.
So you have to ask what motivated most of these soldiers to stay there. First of all, they were in it. They were committed. But why were they committed? Largely because they believed they were fighting in the cause of God. And they got this idea mostly from their pastors who preached it. And the pastors didn't just preach it, but many of the pastors joined the army themselves and also became chaplains of the Continental Army. There's a pastor named Muhlenberg who was a Lutheran pastor turned soldier. He, in the beginning of the war in Virginia, he actually recruited over 300 of the men of his congregation to join him, to join the army, and he himself became a soldier. I already mentioned Benjamin Pomeroy, and then let's see here. James Caldwell was a New Jersey pastor, served as a chaplain and an officer. His wife was killed and his home was burned. John Witherspoon is a huge figure in the Revolution. He was president of Princeton at the time of the Revolution. He was a Presbyterian, and he was also a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he pushed for the Revolution. Just to remind ourselves that these aren't just your typical Americans. Back then, most of them were devout Christians. They were believers. They had faith in God, and so they relied upon God's word in order to maintain the course and to put up with these horrible hardships. But so back to Valley Forge.
I did want to say on that with George Washington. Mm-hmm. Obviously he's asking for supplies like all over, as much as he can, and the Continental Congress gives him permission, from them at least, to take whatever he needed from surrounding farms.
Oh yeah.
And he did not. He opted to just eat nothing. I don't know about eat nothing, but like he
didn't want to
thought it was wrong, and he didn't want to turn the colonists against them because they started taking things from him.
No, so talking about religious backgrounds, George Washington was a member of the Anglican Church, believe it or not, the Church of England, up until the time of the Revolution. So He was deeply religious, but from all accounts, as I can tell, if you actually use your biblical discernment, he was not I don't believe he was a true believer, because he never talks about God in a personal way at all.
Yeah.
He always refers to God. Most of the time, he refers to God as the divine supreme being who is over all, and who most of the time when he refers to God, he speaks of providence or divine providence.
Yeah.
So he believed God was in control of all events, but from the way he speaks of God, he didn't believe God was his personal savior of sin. So just to talk about a little bit about his religious background. He was very religious. He read the Bible, but I don't believe he had personal faith in Jesus. In fact, from a lot of historical research in analyzing his writings and the way he spoke, at some point he actually became a Freemason, which is a cult. So he was a deist slash cult member, although he still was very sympathetic towards Christianity. In fact, he encouraged the chaplains of his army to preach to his soldiers.
Yeah.
And he encouraged the Continental Congress, the government officials, to rely upon God. In fact, he participated in I don't know if up until this point they were doing it, but the Continental Congress actually issued proclamations to the colonies for various fast days for days of prayer and fasting, to seek the Lord's favor and His provision and mercy, as well as days of thanksgiving for victories.
Yeah.
And so, you can go. Go ahead.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy as far as hard to find a more moral person.
Right.
But yeah, as far as his
he did not preach the gospel, though.
Yeah, as far as his faith in Jesus, there's not much evidence for it.
In fact, I would say none.
Yeah.
He had faith in a God, but so
I would say even he had faith in his moral system. I mean, he was so moral,
right,
that he was above reproach from anybody.
Now let's, in just one instance of this morality, is that he was definitely he was one of the best leaders that you can study in history, even though non-Christian. But in Valley Forge, he would walk among his soldiers, and he would talk to them and try to encourage them. And he himself he didn't want to live it up as an officer while they were suffering in their tents. So he denied himself.
And he was exactly what the Americans needed.
Right.
As far as, like we said, they had to keep an army in the field, and he was the one that kept them together.
Right.
I mean, no, go ahead.
Well, I was not only so they survived the winter, basically by a miracle.
Yeah.
Of God, they keep themselves alive for the most part. Although a lot
were deaths.
A lot of them die of starvation.
But they have an army by the spring still somehow.
Starvation and
cold,
hypothermia,
pneumonia.
But so in the spring we get von Steuben.
Yeah.
Right? The German guy.
Yeah.
This is ragtag. We have to remember, these are not professional soldiers. They are volunteers. They are farmers. They are artisans. They are blacksmiths. They are fishermen. They're not professional soldiers. So von Steuben comes over. He is a Austrian, right? Austrian.
I thought he was German.
Or German. What a German. Yeah, German officer who was actually he was, I believe, if I'm vaguely remembering correctly, he was a devout Lutheran. So he whipped them into shape. So by the time of the summer
if I may on that,
something
interesting that he said about the Americans, because but afterwards he said,
he got there during the winter, actually.
Yeah, he did.
And he said, "This is not an army. This is a bunch of skeletons."
Yeah. But so he said about the Americans, he said, I love them. I love training them. Because with the European army, you tell them what to do and they do it. With the Americans, you tell them what to do and they go, why? And then he goes, which at first I was kind of annoyed about, but then as you're training them, and they keep asking why, and I keep explaining it to them, by the end, you have all these men that understand exactly why they're doing what they're doing.
Right.
And he was very impressed by that. I mean, just that spirit of like, the Americans are like, why? Like, I want to understand what I'm doing.
Questioning attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the year 1778, right?
Going into 1778, yeah.
So what were the big events in 1778? Once the Continental Army is basically they are pretty much trained largely through him into a pretty much very professional.
Yeah.
Like he drilled them and drilled them and drilled them and drilled them until they were now able to fight a conventional type of warfare.
Which is a little bit ironic because Washington didn't fight many more battles after this. Like
the biggest battle after this was basically Yorktown.
Yeah,
with the Continental Army at least, because
there
was major fighting in the South. But we got to speed up.
Yeah,
we're getting close to the hour mark.
Let's jump down to a quick overview of Yorktown. Basically, the British decided to fight in the South, and there
were many. There was at least one major American defeat in the South. I know.
Well, basically,
Savannah.
The British took Savannah. They took Charleston.
But then actually in the later stages, there were a lot of American victories in the South.
Yeah,
I forgot which ones they were, but they were basically the Americans by leading up to Yorktown. The Americans were winning in the South.
Yeah,
I think
so. This one was interesting to me. One of the big battles that really forced Cornwallis, he was the commander, to go north and be like, I'm done with the Carolinas, was, I forget what the name of it was. He sent off his regulars, maybe like 1,000 men, and they were chasing 1,000 men of the revolutionaries, the Americans, and the guy sets them up. I think it was Morgan was his last name, the American, and a lot of them were militia. And he sets them up with their back to the river to fight, to make their stand, which is a terrible idea generally, because you have no place to retreat to.
Although it does motivate you to fight.
That's what he said, because the militia the militia would always run, and so he says to the militia, he's like, all I want from you, 2 shots. I want you each to fire 2 shots, and then you can run. And so they're like, okay, we can do well, but it was brilliant though, because they're 8 in the center, and the British start coming. They fire their 2 shots. They were true to their word, and then they ditch.
Now we have to remember these are muzzle loaders, so it took them
it takes
a few minutes after the first shot, unless they had a previously loaded gun.
I think they have one loaded and then like a row behind them, and so they shoot, and then the other row gets up and waits a minute and shoots as the first people are knelt down like reloading, and so they get their 2 shots off and they bolt, but they have to bolt to the side. They can't go back, and so then the British are like, oh, it's happening again with those cowardly militia. They see us and they run. And so the British, which is like this is their best soldiers down in the South, they march straight at them. And the American leader was prepared for that, and he had actually put the regulars right behind the militia there. And so he's like, just wait for them; they're going to come right at you. And so they come right at him, and the regulars then pop up and just maul them to pieces. Like that first round is like deadly. But so then the militia, who weren't able to run back, had run off to the side, and they've reloaded at this point. And they're like, hey, look, we flanked them, and they're right on the sides, and they start shooting them from the sides, and the British guy's forced to surrender, and that was half of the forces, the British forces in the South, just gone, and the good half too, like the regulars, and that's why Cornwallis is like, we got to get out of here. And I guess just as a point of that that impressed me was just kind of like using what you have, and even thinking in life where it's like, even if you're looking at something and be like, I wish I had more, or like, this is all I can get out of this. Well, think of how you can use what you can get out of that. And I thought that was interesting. So use
people's faults for their benefit, for their improvement.
So basically, Cornwallis has to get up to Yorktown, and for the sake of time, we'll just say it was a terrible place to go. The French blockaded around him, and there was only one way out, and Washington popped down and blocked him.
And siege them until they
surrendered. And Cornwallis realized pretty quick that it was not good, and so he surrenders, and the British at that point, all except for King George, were like, wow, it's over. George wanted to keep fighting, but think about it at this point.
But actually, Parliament said no.
Yeah, Parliament said no. I mean, because at this point, you could raise up another army, yes, and you could send it. We've lost 2 armies in the field, like 2 entire armies gone, Burgoyne's and Cornwallis's, and like we're no closer. We're further away. And to think that we'll send it there, and they're all like, the Americans are all excited. Like, how long is this going to take? It's been 6 years already. And so that's why the British are like, we're done. Like, we can't just keep dropping resources. Remember, they were way in debt beforehand. That was why they were trying to tax the Americans.
Right. So what was the aftermath of the American victory? How did the Continental Congress, how did they start the nation?
Yeah. Oh, first I did want to say, this is a little note on Washington. And so the big question was, what would Washington do? Because he's got the army. If he wanted to take charge, he's got it. Nobody can stop him. And the army loves him. And so, and a little note on him was, he retired, went back to his farm.
Yeah. But after a while.
He was called back, yeah.
He was still in command for a while after Yorktown.
Yeah, I mean, until things had settled down, but like his intent, and eventually he did, go back to his farm, was not to take over. And when asked about it, or King George asked about it, and like basically, well, what's Washington doing? He just figured he was the new leader, the new king. And they said he went back to his farm, and King George didn't really believe it. And he's like, if that's true, he's the greatest man that ever lived, was what King George said. Which, I don't know, I thought a lie, but what was interesting. But yeah, so then the colonies are now have their independence. So what do you do with that? And they draw up the Articles of Confederation, which were terrible. Basically, they put all the power in the states, did not have a federal government that was stronger than the states, and their fear was creating another tyrannical government and just getting right back in the same spot. But then when the federal government doesn't even have the ability to tax the people to pay off all these debts.
Well, there is no federal government.
I mean, there was. It just had no power.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember now.
And they're like, and all the soldiers are like, remember, you did promise to pay us when this was over. And like, and a whole bunch of, not just soldiers, but everybody they promised to pay. And they're like, we actually have no money at all, and no way of getting money.
Right.
And it became pretty evident pretty quickly that something needed to be done, though there was a lot of debate about what that was. And a small group actually wrote the Constitution, and it got together to talk about what to do, and they weren't even like sanctioned to do. It was more just like, yeah, you guys can go and discuss ways to fix this, and then and they kept things under wrap pretty well. And then after a couple months, they're like, here, we wrote a new Constitution, just redid the whole thing. And it was like, what? But they put in how to ratify it and everything, and obviously it was eventually.
Right. So the Peace Treaty of Paris happened was officially settled in 1783.
Yep.
Ending the war, and the Constitution was drafted in 1786. 1787.
I was thinking 1787, but
1787 sounds about right. So you have the United States. George Washington. At first, they're thinking that he might be the new king. He doesn't want to do that, obviously, and most of them don't want that to happen anyway. But he is. So with the Constitution, they set up the government with the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. You have a Congress. You have a legislative branch with the Congress and House of Representatives.
So it's the Senate.
I'm sorry, Senate
and the House of Representatives.
Senate and House of Representatives. You have the president and his committee, and then you have the judicial branch with a bunch of judges. The Supreme Court. Excuse me. So George Washington, obviously, he is asked to become the president. Yeah. And he becomes the president.
Unanimous. How about that?
Yeah.
We've got an election coming up. I don't think it'll be unanimous.
So he seems to be a pretty good president. Now, one thing I wanted to pretty special event I wanted to point out was at the end of the war, when all this constitutional stuff is going on. Actually, they print out thousands of Bibles in Philadelphia. There was a proposal because there was a shortage of Bibles because they got all their Bibles, which were copyrighted by by the crown, by the British Crown. Remember the King James Bible.
Yeah.
It was copyrighted by the British Crown. So they got thousands of Bibles to be printed in America that were endorsed by the Congress before this in Philadelphia. That's just one thing that the Congress actually approved before officially the United States was formed through the Constitution. So you have all these Bibles going around, and so from this point, what is the situation with the United States? How do we describe it?
With, like, after George Washington is the president?
Yeah.
I would say it is feeling its way out there as far as what it is. And Washington was out.
What are the plans they had to do? What did they need to take care of in because of the war in order to...
I mean, I think one of the first things they had to do was debt, which Alexander Hamilton played a big role in that. He basically came in and says, we have to promise everybody we'll pay him back.
Right.
And, and everyone's like, what are you talking about? Like, no, we have to.
Yeah.
And that basically, like, made everybody be like, oh, okay, we'll trade with you then. Mm-hmm. And actually, trade was another big one in getting the other European powers to recognize them. Because the British were kind of like, all right, you got your independence. Let's watch you flounder now.
Yeah.
And at first they were.
Right.
And the other nations. So basically, the other nations are like, if we'll make a deal with you where we get like a monopoly on trade and stuff, which is basically like we'll make you our colonies. And so trying to navigate that so that it's like, no, we are an independent nation that should be treated like its own nation, and it's also they were dealing with mercantilism, where all the European powers were like, we really don't want to trade that much with other nations. We want to make our own stuff. We want to have our colonies that provide the stuff to us, and then we sell it back to them, and that's our economic system. So they were in a pretty rough economic spot at the beginning, and so just trying to show legitimacy, financially, to get money that way, and then also try to not have any of the other European powers take advantage of them as they were like just coming into the world stage.
Mm-hmm. Now here's a big question nowadays, and I want to know what your thought is on this, Casey. Were the United States of America, was it founded as would you describe it accurately as a Christian nation?
That is a tough one. I mean, I'd certainly say there were Christian principles to, that it was founded on. Christian nation. I mean, it's one of those where everybody basically either wasn't Christian or nominally Christian.
There were.
What was that?
There were nominally.
No. I'm saying it wasn't like anybody was saying they shouldn't be a Christian nation. Mm-hmm. Everybody would have agreed that they were a Christian nation. As far as if it was actually a Christian nation in its founding, yeah, that's a good question. That's debatable. Like I said, they were founded on the principles. You had a lot of Christians in government. Mm-hmm. Its purpose wasn't to spread the gospel or anything like that.
Right,
though.
Although that it did do that.
It did, and it was.
They did do that.
Yeah. I don't know. I didn't really answer your question. What do you think?
Christian nation. It was Christianly. I'd say. Many of the leaders were Christians. They were, the principles of the government were were based on Christian principles, biblical principles. But I wouldn't. For the most part, the population were Christian, I'd say, but I wouldn't just call it a Christian nation, because I think a Christian nation would be a nation where at least all the leaders are Christians. I think at the very least, and that the government designs, their ambitions, their plans are explicitly Christian. So I wouldn't call it a Christian nation. But so big lessons we can learn from the American Revolution. I think number one, I think the Lord was was showing the wisdom of his word, because they did use principles of his word in order to found the nation.
Yeah.
And it's I think there's no question that America is exceptional in world history with nations. That it is it was at the beginning one of the most just and moral and gospel sympathetic nations in world history. There's no question about that. However, a lot of the leaders were not Christians, especially the main ones we think about. They were not believers. But and then so what can we learn? What would you say a big takeaway from?
All right. So I don't know if I'd call these big ones, but more just like things that I was impressed with. We talked a little bit about Benedict Arnold earlier, and I probably portrayed is I was very impressed with his early service and the role that he played. But just as a warning, a bad ending will takes away a lot of good. And I think about like pastors or church leaders that you hear at the end that they had an affair, they did something like that, even though they put their whole life into service, and they falter, and that becomes their legacy. And so just seeing that to be like, yeah, you can almost give your life for your country, and then if you turncoat, that
you're a traitor for the rest of history.
Yeah, which I don't think he really regretted it that much. But like for a church leader, you can have somebody that makes a mistake and they repent of it, but that's what you're remembered for. Another one was the infighting among generals on both sides was very impressive. How much this was just a pride thing. How much so for the British, this was literally a chance if you're a British general to be like, oh great, I want to go over and I want to win glory for myself. And so you get over there and the other general says, all right, I need you to come here at this time. And you're like, no, that'll just help you win glory. And they literally, their decisions would be based on how can I get myself more glory, and I don't like you. And the Americans weren't much better. But just like I said, that was amazing to me how much that influenced their fighting, how much it played a role, and just to think not to be like that as we fight for the gospel, not to have pride be a factor, not to worry about other people's glory or how not to let that be an issue. And then another one I had was just a bit about the American spirit of they kept losing battles. But they'd always just keep coming back. Even when the British took this city and this city and this city, and they had their army sitting in the field, and by European battle standards, they won. They should have won. But the Americans are just like, nope, we're gonna keep fighting. We can just make another army, and we'll just, sure, it's militia, but everybody just keeps joining. We'll keep fighting. We'll get beat. We'll come back. And so even just to have that mentality of, even if it looks like by the world standards the world has won, not to give up, and just to have that mentality of we will always keep fighting for the gospel. It doesn't matter, you cannot stop us. Right.
And we got to remember in closing that people are now under the tyranny of, as they were back then, people are under the tyranny of the devil, and the only thing that can liberate them is the gospel of peace, of salvation. So we need to worship the Lord. The Lord is king over all the nations, all the kings of the earth. He is over all, and we are his ambassadors as his people, and we need to be ambassadors for Christ and set out to set the captives at liberty like Jesus did.
Amen.
Any closing comments?
No, I think I'm good.
All right, thanks for listening to another episode of The King's Hand in History. We have a Facebook group called The King's Hand in History Students. You can join if you're on there. Also, we appreciate if you would subscribe and or leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless.